The wind tore through the trees like something alive, and the pounding on the door was so weak that Illyra almost missed it under the howl of the storm. She froze at her spinning wheel, her fingers still tangled in wool, her ears straining. There it was again, a soft, broken sound, half a knock and half a whimper, coming from just beyond her threshold. She rose quickly, her hand finding the wall to guide her the way she always did, tracing the familiar grooves in the wood until she reached the door. Snow slid in the moment she opened it, biting at her face, and with it came a smell of blood and fear and something wild. At her feet lay a shape, low and shivering, its breath coming out in short, ragged bursts. Illyra knelt at once, her hands finding thick, matted fur, ribs that pressed too closely against skin, and a body trembling from cold or pain or both. A dog, she thought. A wolf, maybe. Whatever it was dying out here, and she was not going to let that happen on her doorstep. "Come inside," she whispered, as if the creature could understand her, as if speaking softly might convince it to trust her. She looped her arms beneath its body and pulled, and though it was heavier than she expected, it did not resist. It let her drag it over the threshold and close the door against the screaming wind. What Illyra did not know, could not know, was that the creature curled on her floor was not a dog, and not truly a wolf either, not in the way she believed. Beneath the torn fur and the trembling muscle was Kalen Voss, Alpha King of the Nightfall Kingdom, a man who commanded armies and sat upon a throne carved from black stone, now reduced to this. 3 nights ago, arrows had found him in his own courtyard, loosed by hands he had trusted. He had shifted to escape, running until his body could run no more, bleeding into the snow, hunted by wolves who wore his own colors. He had smelled wood smoke and warmth on the wind, and followed it with the last of his strength, never expecting kindness, only hoping for a place to die that was not open to the sky. Instead, he found her. Illyra lit a second candle from the one already burning, and set a kettle near the fire, her movements practiced, despite the darkness she had lived in since birth. She could not see the wolf's eyes, sharp and gold, and watching her with a wariness that had nothing to do with animal instinct, and everything to do with a king, unsure whether he had stumbled into another trap. But she did not need sight to feel the tension in the room, the held breath of a creature deciding whether to trust her. "You're safe," she said, kneeling again beside him, her hands moving gently over his fur, searching for wounds. She found one along his flank, deep and still weeping, and made a soft sound of sympathy before rising to fetch cloth and the jar of herbal salve her mother had taught her to make years ago. "I know you can't understand a word I'm saying, but it helps me to talk. Living out here alone, sometimes the silence gets too loud." Kalen watched her work, and understanding was exactly what he had. Every word she spoke landed somewhere deep in him, a place that had gone numb from years of court flattery and hollow loyalty. Nobody in his own castle spoke to him the way this blind stranger spoke to a stray she believed could not comprehend her. There was no calculation in her voice, no hidden request, just plain, unguarded care. His mind drifted, unbidden, back to the courtyard 3 nights before, torches burning against the early evening dark, the familiar clatter of the castle settling into its nightly rhythm. He remembered the first arrow whistling past his shoulder before he even registered the threat, the second finding his side moments later, the shouted alarm rising too late from guards who should have seen the danger sooner. He remembered the faces of men he had called brothers turning against him in the chaos, and the desperate, animal decision to shift and run, rather than stand and question who among his own guard had turned traitor. He had run until the castle lights disappeared behind him, until the cold swallowed the pain, until nothing remained but the raw need to survive 1 more hour, 1 more mile, 1 more breath. He had expected to die somewhere in these woods, forgotten and unclaimed. Instead, here he lay, warm beside a stranger's fire, her hands gentle against wounds that should have ended him. She cleaned the wound with careful fingers, wincing in sympathy whenever he flinched, murmuring apologies, though she could not see the damage she was tending. Kalen wanted to shift back then, wanted to sit up as a man and tell her who he was and thank her properly, but his body would not allow it. The change took strength he simply did not have, and some deep, cautious part of him whispered that revealing himself now, weak and hunted, might only bring danger to her door along with him. So he stayed silent in the only way he could, and let her believe him voiceless. When the wound was bound, Illyra sat back on her heels and let out a slow breath. There. That should help some. Her stomach growled, loud in the quiet cabin, and she pressed a hand against it with a small, tired laugh. Guess we're both hungry tonight. She moved toward the hearth, where a small pot hung above the low flame, and lifted the lid to check what remained of her stew. It was not much. A thin broth with a few pieces of potato and a sliver of dried meat, rationed carefully to last her through the next 3 days, until she could trade wool at the village for more supplies. Winter had been unkind, and her stores were thinner than she liked to admit. She ladled a portion into a shallow bowl and carried it to where the wolf lay, setting it down within reach of his nose. The smell of food, however meager, made his stomach twist with hunger sharper than he expected. Even kings went hungry when hunted through frozen woods for 3 days straight. Eat, she encouraged, nudging the bowl closer. You need it more than I do right now. Kalen hesitated only a moment before lowering his head to the broth, careful even now, some old habit of restraint refusing to let him seem too eager. Elira settled beside him, her own bowl balanced on her knees, and ate in companionable quiet, occasionally reaching out to check that he was still eating, still breathing, still there. It was only later, once the fire had burned lower and the storm outside had softened to a gentler hiss of snow against the shutters, that Kalen understood what she had done. Her portion had been smaller than his, far smaller. She had given him the larger share of what little food she had, without a second thought, without expecting thanks, believing him nothing more than a starving animal who had wandered into her life by chance. No one in the Nightfall Court had ever given him anything without wanting something in return. Not loyalty bought with land, not smiles offered for favor, not even his own counsel, who wrapped their ambitions in careful words of duty. And yet this woman, who owned almost nothing and could see even less, had split her last real meal between herself and a stranger who might have torn her throat out if he were truly the animal she believed him to be. He watched her through half-lidded eyes as she banked the fire for the night, her movements unhurried, despite the ache he could see in her thin shoulders, the exhaustion she carried quietly. She hummed something low and wordless as she worked, a tune that seemed to ease her own nerves as much as anyone else's. "You'll stay the night," she said eventually, more statement than question, settling onto a woven mat near the hearth rather than her own narrow bed, close enough to keep watch over him despite her blindness, as if her ears alone were guard enough. "Tomorrow, if you're strong enough, you can go wherever you need to go. But tonight, you rest." Kalen wanted to tell her that where he needed to go was a castle full of enemies, wearing the faces of friends, that somewhere out in that storm, men were combing the woods with orders to bring back his head if they could not bring back the rest of him. He wanted to tell her that she had just fed and sheltered the most hunted man in the kingdom, and that gratitude alone could never repay what she had given so freely. Instead, he laid his head down near her outstretched hand, allowing himself, for the first time in 3 days, to believe he might survive the night. Her fingers found the top of his head in the dark, resting there lightly, a small unconscious gesture of comfort that steadied something fractured deep inside him. Outside, the wind screamed on, indifferent to kings and killers and blind women who gave away their last meal without hesitation. But inside the small cabin at the edge of Thornwood territory, warmth had found its way in, carried on the back of a stranger who asked for nothing and received, in return, more honesty than any crown had ever earned him. Elira did not sleep easily that night. Every few hours she woke to check on her unexpected guest, her hand drifting to his side to feel the rhythm of his breathing, relief flooding her each time she found it steady and strong. She did not know why she felt so protective of a creature she had known for only a handful of hours. Perhaps it was simply the loneliness of her days, the quiet ache of a life lived apart from a pack that had never fully accepted her, that made her cling so tightly to this small, fragile connection. Kalen, for his part, drifted in and out of a healing sleep, his body working to mend itself, even as his mind turned over the strange gift he had been given. Somewhere beyond these walls, his enemies believed him dead or dying, and perhaps that belief would buy him the time he needed to heal, to plan, to eventually return and reclaim what was his. But for tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, there was only the crackle of a dying fire, the soft breathing of a woman who had shared everything she had with a stranger, and the strange, unfamiliar warmth of being cared for without condition. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray through the frost-covered window, Elira woke to find the wolf's breathing steadier, his body less rigid with pain than it had been the night before. She smiled, relief loosening the tension she had carried through the dark hours, and reached out once more, to stroke the fur at his neck. "Good," she murmured. "You're stronger already." She could not see the way his golden eyes watched her in the weak morning light, could not see the conflict written plainly across a face she had never once glimpsed. But she could feel, in the way he leaned faintly into her touch, something that felt remarkably like gratitude, and beneath that, something else entirely, something neither of them was ready to name. Outside, the storm had passed, but somewhere in the distance, faint and easy to miss beneath the settling snow, came the sound of hoofbeats. Search parties, moving through the borderlands, looking for a king who was supposed to be dying alone in the wilderness. Kaylin's ears twitched toward the sound, every instinct sharpening at once, the peace of the morning shattering into something far more dangerous. She had lived at the edge of Thornwood territory long enough to know every ordinary sound the woods could offer, the settling of snow, the shift of branches under weight, the calls of birds returning after a storm. This was none of those things, and the sudden rigidity in the wolf beside her told her clearly enough that whatever approached carried purpose rather than accident. Elira felt him tense beneath her hand and frowned, her sightless eyes turning toward the door, as if she could somehow see what had startled him. "What is it?" she asked softly. "What's wrong?" He had no way to answer her, no way to warn her that danger might be riding straight toward this quiet cabin, drawn by a trail he had tried so hard to hide. All he could do was press closer to her side, a silent and desperate promise that whatever came next, he would not let harm reach her, not after everything she had already given him. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and somewhere beneath the fur and the silence, a king who had lost everything began to understand that he had just found something worth protecting, with whatever strength he had left. The hoofbeats grew closer, cutting through the quiet morning, and Elira's hand tightened instinctively in the wolf's fur. She had lived alone long enough to know that riders rarely came this deep into Thornwood territory without reason, and reason this early after a storm usually meant trouble. She rose carefully, her senses stretched wide, listening past the crunch of snow to the murmur of voices carried faintly on the wind. "Stay low," she whispered to the creature beside her, though she barely understood why she felt the need to protect him from whoever approached. Some instinct, sharper than logic, told her this stray was not simply lost. He had arrived wounded and desperate, and now riders were searching the woods around her home. The pieces did not need sight to be seen. Kaylin pressed himself against the floorboards near the hearth, out of reach of the door, his breathing shallow and controlled. He recognized the voices even through the walls, low and clipped, the tone of soldiers following orders, rather than following their own will. These were not villagers looking for a lost goat. These were trained men, moving with purpose, searching a trail that led toward this very cabin. The knock, when it came, was firm and impatient, nothing like the desperate scratching of 2 nights before. Elira moved to the door, steadying her voice before she opened it, just enough to let in a slice of cold air. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone even despite the hammering of her heart. "Apologies for the early hour," said a rough voice, clearly the leader among them. "We're searching for signs of an injured wolf. Might have passed through here in the last few days. Large, dark coat, likely wounded. Seen anything like that?" Elira kept her expression carefully neutral, grateful in that moment that her blindness had long ago taught her how to mask her thoughts, how to control her breathing and her voice when nothing about her face could betray her. "I've heard wolves in the distance most nights," she said honestly enough, "but nothing come near my door. It's just me out here." The soldier grunted, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to press further. "If you see anything, alert the nearest patrol. This wolf is dangerous, understood? Best not to approach it yourself." "Understood," Elira replied, and after a moment, she heard the crunch of boots retreating, followed by the shifting weight of horses moving away from her home. She stood at the door a while longer, listening until every trace of sound had faded into the trees, before finally closing it and letting out a long breath she had not realized she was holding. "They're gone," she said, turning back toward the hearth, and only then did she allow herself to shake slightly, adrenaline draining from her limbs. Why would soldiers be looking for a wolf all the way out here? And why would they call you dangerous? Kaylin lifted his head, guilt washing through him at the lie she had just told on his behalf, a lie that could have brought real consequences down on her if discovered. He had no way to explain, no way to apologize properly, and the helplessness of that silence gnawed at him more than any wound on his body. She thought of her pack, the one she had been born into but never truly belonged to, the whispered comments about her blindness that had followed her since childhood, the assumption that she required protection, rather than being capable of offering it herself. Standing at that door moments ago, lying smoothly to armed soldiers without a single tremor in her voice, she had felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely capable. Whatever this creature was, whatever danger followed him, he had given her that moment of quiet strength without ever meaning to. Alira knelt beside him again, running her hands slowly along his back, checking for tension, for any sign that he understood more than she gave him credit for. "Doesn't matter," she said eventually, more to herself than to him. "Whatever you are, whatever trouble follows you, you're still just a hurting creature who needed help. I couldn't have turned you out even if I wanted to." Days passed in a quiet rhythm neither of them had expected to find. Alira continued her work, spinning wool by the fire, mending small tears in her worn clothing, trading gentle conversation with a companion, who could only answer through the tilt of his head, or the soft press of his body against her leg. She told him about her childhood, how she had been born blind into a pack that valued strength and sharp instincts above all else, how omegas like her were often overlooked, considered burdens rather than assets. She spoke of her mother, who had taught her every skill she now relied on, before passing from a long illness, leaving Alira entirely alone at the edge of packlands nobody else wanted to claim. "They think I can't manage on my own," she said one evening, feeding another small log into the fire. "But I've managed just fine for 3 years now. Better than fine, most days." There was pride in her voice, quiet but unmistakable, the kind earned through hardship rather than given freely. Kalen listened to every word with a growing ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his healing wounds. He thought of his own upbringing, drowning in tutors and protectors and endless lessons on diplomacy and warfare, never once allowed a moment of true vulnerability, never trusted to simply exist without purpose or expectation. Alira's isolation, born of prejudice rather than duty, felt like a mirror held up to his own loneliness, different in cause but startlingly similar in weight. There were moments during those quiet days when Kalen found himself almost forgetting the throne waiting for him, the danger circling somewhere beyond the tree line, the identity he had carried his entire life like a weight bolted to his shoulders. In this small cabin he was simply a creature being cared for, judged by nothing beyond his willingness to accept kindness and offer companionship in return. He had not realized, until experiencing its absence, how heavily the constant performance of kingship had pressed upon him, every gesture calculated, every word measured for its political weight. Here, curled by a modest fire with a woman who spoke to him as an equal, despite believing him incapable of understanding, he felt something close to peace for the first time in years. By the 4th day, his wounds had closed enough that he could stand without trembling, could move around the small cabin with growing steadiness. Alira noticed the change immediately, her fingers tracing the healed skin beneath his fur with obvious relief. "You're healing fast," she said, a note of something like sadness threading through her words. "Guess that means you'll be moving on soon." Kalen wanted desperately to tell her that he had nowhere safe to move on to, that the moment he stepped beyond her door, as anything other than this wolf, he risked being discovered by the very people hunting him. But more than that, some quieter truth had begun to settle in him, one he barely recognized. He did not want to leave, not yet, perhaps not at all. That night, as Alira prepared what remained of her food stores, dividing a small portion of dried fish between them, Kalen watched her movements with new eyes. She never hesitated, never resented the sharing, treated the having of her already thin meals as simply the natural order of things. He thought of the feasts held in his own castle, tables groaning under food that often went to waste, while guards outside the walls sometimes went hungry, and felt something close to shame at the contrast. "You should eat more," he wanted to tell her, though of course he could not, and instead nudged the larger portion of fish back toward her side of the small wooden board they used as a shared plate. She laughed softly, surprised. "Trying to give it back to me? No, you eat that, you need to heal." She pushed it toward him again, gentle but firm, and something in Kalen's chest tightened at the simple stubbornness of her kindness. He had spent his entire life being given things because of who he was, his crown, his bloodline, his power. This woman gave because of who she was, and that distinction settled into him like a lesson he had needed to learn for a very long time. As the days blurred into a week, a quiet routine formed between them, comfortable in its simplicity. Elira would wake before dawn, tending the fire, and preparing what little food remained, speaking softly to fill the silence she had grown so used to living within. Kalen, in turn, found himself anticipating the sound of her voice, the particular cadence of her humming as she worked, the warmth of her hand, resting against his fur in the quiet moments before sleep. He told himself this closeness was simply gratitude, simply the natural bond formed between someone rescued and someone who had done the rescuing. But some nights, lying awake while she slept nearby, he wondered if it was something far more complicated than gratitude alone. One afternoon, while Elira was outside collecting firewood, Kalen caught the distant scent of something troubling carried on the wind, faint traces of wolves, who did not belong to Thornwood territory, moving with the disciplined patterns of trained trackers rather than wild pack members. His enemies had not given up the search. If anything, their efforts seemed to be narrowing, closing in on the very borderlands where Elira's cabin stood isolated and unprotected. He understood then that his presence here, however comforting, however unexpectedly precious it had become, placed her in genuine danger. Every day he remained beneath her roof was another day the trail might lead straight to her door. Another day the men hunting him might discover exactly who had been sheltering their target. The weight of that realization settled heavily in his chest as Elira returned inside, arms full of wood, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, completely unaware of the danger drawing steadily nearer. "You seem tense," she observed, setting the wood beside the hearth and reaching out instinctively to check on him, her fingers finding the stiffness in his shoulders immediately, despite his attempt to hide it. "Is something wrong?" Kalen pressed his head gently against her hand, wishing more than anything that he could simply tell her the truth, warn her properly, give her the choice to send him away before danger arrived at her doorstep uninvited. But the words remained locked behind a silence he could not yet break, and all he could offer was the quiet comfort of his presence, a promise made without language that whatever came next, he would not let harm reach her without a fight. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint, distant howl of wolves that did not belong to this land, drawing closer with every passing hour, unaware that the king they hunted had already found something in this quiet cabin, worth far more than the crown they believed he had lost. That night, sleep would not come easily to Kalen. He lay near the dying fire, ears tuned to every sound beyond the cabin walls, while Elira slept soundly on her mat nearby, trusting the quiet of her home, the way she always had. He envied that trust, even as he feared for it, knowing that danger no longer lingered at a distance, but crept steadily closer with each passing hour. Sometime near midnight, faint voices carried on the wind, low and hushed, moving through the trees not far beyond the cabin's edge. Kalen rose silently, careful not to wake Elira, and crept toward the door, straining to catch the words before they faded. "Trail went cold near the frozen creek, but Garrick says the king's scent circled back this way before the storm hit," one voice muttered. "If he's dead in a ditch somewhere, half of us lose our bounty," another grumbled. "Garrick wants proof either way, a body or a head, he doesn't care which." Kalen's blood ran cold at the casual cruelty in their tone, at the confirmation that Garrick, a noble he had once trusted enough to seat at his council table, stood behind the attempt on his life. Ambition, it seemed, had finally outweighed loyalty in a man Kalen had considered almost a brother. The betrayal stung sharper than any arrow wound, a wound that would not close with herbs or rest. The voices faded as the rogue wolves moved further along the tree line, apparently unwilling to search too close to inhabited land in the dead of night, but the reprieve felt temporary at best. Kalen returned to his place by the fire, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them safe, none of them simple. He could leave now, slip away in the darkness, and lead the search further from Elira's home, drawing danger away from the one place that had offered him true shelter. But his body remained weaker than he liked to admit, and traveling alone through hostile territory in his current state might mean walking straight into the hands of the very men hunting him. Or he could stay, trusting that Elira's isolation and her careful lie to the earlier patrol might continue to protect them both, at least until he regained enough strength to face his enemies properly. But staying meant risking her safety with every day that passed, a risk he was no longer certain he had the right to ask of her, especially without her full understanding of what exactly she was risking. He thought of Doran, his most trusted captain, likely tearing the borderlands apart searching for some sign of his survival, unaware that the king he served remained hidden, not through any enemy's cunning, but through his own choice to stay silent a little longer. He wondered whether word of his disappearance had reached the wider kingdom yet, whether rival packs along the northern border had begun testing the stability of a throne suddenly without its occupant. Every hour he remained hidden carried consequences beyond this small cabin, consequences that stretched across an entire kingdom, depending on his steady rule. And yet, weighed against those distant concerns, the immediate safety of the woman sleeping peacefully nearby, felt, in this quiet moment, far more urgent than any throne. When morning came, Illyra noticed immediately that something weighed on him. She sat close, her hand resting thoughtfully against his side, as she worked through her morning tasks with less of her usual ease. "You've been different since last night," she said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence they usually shared. "Restless. I could feel it even in your breathing." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I know you can't tell me what's wrong. I know you're probably not even understanding half of what I say to you most days. But whatever trouble is following you, I hope it passes soon. I don't like the idea of you carrying that kind of weight alone." Kaelin's chest tightened at her words, at how close she had come to the truth without ever knowing it. He pressed his head against her knee, wishing desperately for the strength to shift, to finally explain everything, to give her the choice she deserved, rather than leaving her blind to the danger circling ever closer to her door. Blind in every sense but the one that mattered most in this moment. Later that day, a visitor arrived at Illyra's cabin, though this one came on foot rather than horseback, and carried none of the disciplined menace of the earlier patrol. Mira, a neighboring Omega who lived closer to the main village, often stopped by with news or small trades, though her visits rarely came without judgment, tucked beneath polite conversation. "I heard soldiers pass through here searching for some dangerous wolf," Mira said, settling onto the small bench near Illyra's door, her voice carrying its usual note of thinly veiled superiority. "You didn't actually let something like that into your home, did you?" Illyra's spine straightened slightly, though her tone remained even. "I helped an injured creature, that's all." Mira's laugh held little warmth. An injured, dangerous creature that soldiers are actively hunting. "Honestly, Illyra, sometimes I wonder if you understand the risks you take living out here alone, blind as you are. It's bad enough the pack barely tolerates your presence at the borderlands. Don't give them more reason to say you can't manage on your own." Kaelin, listening from his place near the hearth, felt something sharp and protective rise in his chest at the casual cruelty in Mira's words, the way she reduced Illyra's kindness to recklessness, her independence to a liability. He wanted, more than anything, to rise and defend her properly, to remind this visitor exactly what real strength looked like. But Illyra needed no defense beyond her own voice. "Everyone deserves care when they're suffering," she said simply, without anger, without apology. "Blind or not, dangerous or not. I won't turn away a creature in pain just because it might be inconvenient for me. That's not weakness, Mira. That's just who I am." Mira huffed but said nothing further on the matter, moving instead to discuss trade prices for wool, before eventually taking her leave, clearly unconvinced, but unwilling to argue further. Once the door closed behind her, Illyra let out a slow breath, some of the earlier tension easing from her shoulders. "Sorry about that," she murmured, moving back toward the hearth where Kaelin waited. "She means well, in her own way, just doesn't always understand that kindness isn't something you ration based on convenience." Kaelin pressed close against her side, overwhelmed by a feeling he barely recognized, something far beyond simple gratitude now, something closer to reverence for a woman who defended her choices, not through anger, but through quiet, unshakable conviction. He thought again of his own court, full of nobles who calculated every kindness for potential advantage, and felt the contrast settle deeper into his understanding of what true character actually looked like. That evening, as they shared another meal split carefully between them, Kaelin noticed Illyra's hands trembling slightly as she ladled the thin broth into their shared bowl. He nudged closer, concerned, and she offered a tired smile in response to his silent question. "Just tired," she admitted. "Winter's hard on everyone, I suppose. But we'll manage. We always do." The word "we" settled warmly in Kaelin's chest, a small thing perhaps, but significant in ways he had not expected. Somewhere along the past days, without either of them fully realizing it, this arrangement had shifted from a stranger, sheltering an injured stray, into something that felt, unmistakably, like partnership. As night fell and Elira settled into an uneasy sleep, exhaustion finally overtaking her despite the worry that lingered in her expression, Kaelin remained awake, watching over her the way she had watched over him during his weakest hours. He understood now, with growing certainty, that leaving her unprotected was no longer an option he could accept, regardless of the danger that still circled somewhere beyond these walls. Whatever came next, whatever truth he eventually had to reveal, he would find a way to protect this woman, who had given him back something he thought he had lost entirely during his years upon the throne: the simple, unshaken belief that kindness could still exist, without condition, without calculation, without any expectation of return. The fire burned low, and beyond the cabin walls, the distant howls of rogue wolves continued their search, patient and relentless, closing in slowly on a secret that would not stay hidden much longer. Far beyond the quiet borderlands where Elira's cabin stood, the halls of Nightfall Castle buzzed with a tension that had not settled since the night of the attack. Doran, captain of the Royal Guard and one of the few people Kaelin trusted without hesitation, paced the length of the war room with barely restrained frustration, his eyes fixed on a map marked with red pins tracing every search party's fruitless path. 3 days of silence, Doran muttered, more to himself than to the advisors seated around the long table. No body, no trace beyond the frozen creek. Either he's dead somewhere we haven't looked, or he's hiding better than any of us gave him credit for. Across the table, Garrick sat with practiced calm, his expression carefully arranged into concern that did not reach his eyes. A tragedy, either way, he said smoothly. Perhaps it's time we discuss contingencies. The kingdom cannot remain without leadership indefinitely. Doran's jaw tightened at the suggestion, suspicion flickering behind his eyes, though he kept his voice level. The king is not dead until we have proof of it, Garrick. I'd think a member of his own council would show more patience before discussing his replacement. Patience is a luxury we may not have, Garrick replied, folding his hands calmly atop the table. Rival packs grow bold in the face of uncertainty. Someone must be prepared to act, should the worst prove true. Later that evening, alone in his quarters, Doran reviewed the reports from the night of the attack once more, searching for details that might have been overlooked in the initial chaos. The guard stationed nearest the courtyard that night had been reassigned only days earlier, a change in rotation Doran himself had not ordered, and one that had conveniently placed less experienced men exactly where the assassins struck. He made a note to trace the origin of that reassignment quietly, without alerting whoever might be responsible, aware that open accusation without solid proof would only strengthen Garrick's position rather than weaken it. Doran said nothing further, though the seed of doubt Garrick had hoped to plant found no fertile ground in the captain's mind. He had served under Kaelin long enough to recognize ambition dressed in the language of duty, and something about Garrick's composure, too smooth, too immediate, struck him as deeply wrong. He resolved, quietly, to watch the noble more closely, even as the official search continued along the borderlands, stretching further with each passing day. Word of the missing king had already begun spreading beyond the castle walls, carried by traveling merchants and worried villagers, twisting with each retelling until rumors ranged from assassination to sudden illness to outright betrayal within the royal family itself. The uncertainty left the kingdom on edge, packs at the borders growing restless, testing boundaries that had remained firm during Kaelin's steady rule. Back at the cabin, Kaelin remained blissfully unaware of the political tremors shaking his kingdom. His awareness narrowed instead to the immediate concerns of healing, hiding, and the growing warmth he felt whenever Elira's hand found his fur in the quiet hours of evening. But even isolated as he was, he could sense the search tightening around the borderlands, the scent of unfamiliar wolves growing more frequent on the wind, patient and methodical in their sweep of the territory. One afternoon, while Elira busied herself mending a torn blanket near the window, Kaelin caught a scent that made every muscle in his body go rigid. Close, too close. A rogue wolf, moving with deliberate care along the tree line, barely a stone's throw from the cabin itself. He rose immediately, positioning himself between Elira and the door, a low growl building in his chest, before he could stop it. Elira's head snapped up at the sound, alarm flashing across her face. "What is it?" she asked, setting aside her mending and reaching for the walking stick she kept near her bed, more out of habit than any real ability to defend herself with it. "Is someone out there?" Kaelin could not answer, could only press closer to the door, every instinct screaming at him to protect the space between danger and the woman who had shown him nothing but kindness. Outside, the crunch of careful footsteps drew nearer, pausing occasionally as though testing the wind for scent, circling the small clearing around Alira's home with unmistakable purpose. Alira held perfectly still, her breathing controlled despite the fear evident in the tension of her shoulders, trusting the wolf's reaction as confirmation that whatever approached was not simply passing through by chance. Long minutes stretched by in agonizing silence, the footsteps pausing directly outside the cabin wall, before, finally, retreating slowly back into the trees, apparently satisfied that nothing of interest lay within. When the tension finally broke, Alira sank onto the bench near the hearth, her hands trembling slightly, as she processed how close danger had come to her doorstep. "That wasn't a normal animal, was it?" she said quietly, not quite a question. "You reacted like you knew exactly what that was." Kaelin pressed his head against her knee, wishing desperately he could offer the reassurance she needed, the explanation she deserved. Instead, he could only remain close, a silent presence, meant to convey safety, even as uncertainty gnawed at both of them in different ways. That night, once Alira had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Kaelin lay awake, turning over the choice that had haunted him since the rogue wolves' voices first carried across the cold night air. He could no longer deny the truth staring him plainly in the face. His continued silence, however necessary it had once seemed for both their protection, had become its own kind of danger. Alira deserved to know exactly what threat she sheltered beneath her roof, deserved the choice to protect herself accordingly, rather than remaining blind to a danger that grew closer with each passing day. But revealing himself carried its own risks. The moment she knew he was not simply an injured stray, but the alpha king of an entire kingdom, hunted by traitors within his own court, her safety would shift from incidental risk to direct target. Whoever discovered that the missing king had been sheltered and healed by a lone Omega on the borderlands would show her no mercy, viewing her as a witness, a liability, perhaps even a conspirator, in whatever narrative Garrick constructed to justify his ambitions. Kaelin weighed these possibilities long into the night, the fire burning low beside him, Alira's steady breathing, the only sound breaking the silence. He thought of his own isolation upon the throne, surrounded by advisors, and yet profoundly alone, trusting no one fully, until circumstance had stripped away every pretense and left him bleeding on a stranger's doorstep. He thought of how quickly, how completely, that stranger had become someone whose safety mattered more to him than his own crown, his own kingdom, his own carefully guarded secrets. By the time dawn's gray light began filtering through the frosted window, Kaelin had reached a decision, though the timing of its execution remained uncertain, dependent on threats that circled ever closer with each passing hour. He would tell her. Not today, perhaps, with his body still healing and his strength not yet fully returned, but soon, before the danger stalking these borderlands finally found its way through her door, regardless of any lie she might tell to protect him. Alira woke slowly, stretching against the morning chill, her hand immediately finding Kaelin's familiar warmth beside her. "Still here," she murmured with quiet relief, as though some part of her had feared, even in sleep, that he might have slipped away in the night to face whatever danger hunted him alone. "I'm not going anywhere," he wished he could tell her, and instead simply leaned into her touch, offering the only reassurance currently within his power. Outside, the world continued its search, patient and relentless, while inside the small cabin, two people bound by circumstance and something far deeper than either fully understood, prepared, unknowingly, for a truth that would change everything between them. 10 days after the storm had first carried Kaelin to her door, Alira's food stores had dwindled to almost nothing, a handful of dried grain, a small wedge of hard cheese, and little else remained on the shelf where she once kept enough to last through the harshest stretches of winter. She had given more than she could spare, day after day, without ever once regretting the choice, but survival was a practical matter, and practical matters required action rather than sentiment alone. She dressed carefully that morning, wrapping herself against the cold, and reached for the small wooden box tucked beneath her bed, the one item in her possession she had never intended to part with. Inside lay a simple silver bracelet, worn smooth with age, the only thing remaining from her mother, beyond memory and inherited skill. Her fingers traced its familiar shape for a long moment, before she closed the box and tucked the bracelet into her pocket. "I'll be back before dark," she told Kalen, kneeling briefly beside him before she left. "Village trading day. I need to get us more food, and this should fetch enough to last a while." Kalen understood enough of her tone, if not her exact words, to recognize sacrifice when he witnessed it. He pressed his head against her hand in silent protest, wishing he could tell her that whatever she carried in her pocket mattered too much to trade away for his sake. But Alira only smiled, mistaking his concern for simple affection, and rose to make her way toward the village. The walk took the better part of an hour, familiar terrain guided by memory, and the careful counting of landmarks she had long ago memorized. When she finally reached the small trading square, the noise of the village settled around her. Familiar voices calling out prices, the creak of cartwheels, the low murmur of gossip that always seemed to travel faster than any official news. She found her way to Owen's stall, an elderly trader who had known her mother years before, and had always shown Alira fair dealing, despite the whispers that sometimes followed her through the square. "Alira," he greeted warmly. "Haven't seen you in some time. Winter treating you well out there on your own?" "Well enough," she replied, producing the bracelet from her pocket and setting it carefully on the counter between them. "I need this traded for grain, dried meat, whatever you can spare that will keep, as much as this is worth." Owen picked up the bracelet, turning it over with practiced assessment, though his voice carried a note of hesitation. "This was your mother's, wasn't it? Alira, are you certain? I can offer you credit instead. No need to part with something like this." "I'm certain," she said firmly, though something in her chest ached at the confirmation. "I need the supplies more than I need to keep a memory locked in a box." He studied her face a moment longer, the same careful assessment he might have given any trade, though something softer lingered beneath it, a memory perhaps of her mother bringing wool to this very stall years before, trading with the same quiet dignity her daughter now carried. "Your mother would be proud of how you've managed out there alone," he said eventually. "Whatever else people whisper about capability and blindness, she'd see the same thing I see, someone managing just fine." Owen sighed, but did not argue further, moving instead to gather what she requested, filling a sack with grain, dried fish, and a small portion of root vegetables that would stretch further than the meager stores she currently possessed. As he worked, he mentioned, almost in passing, strange happenings lately. Soldiers came through, a few days back, asking after a wolf. Description matched nothing I've ever seen in these parts. Dark coat, unusually large, scarred along one side, offering good coin for information. Alira's breath caught, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, the same practiced calm she had shown the patrol at her own door. "Haven't seen anything like that," she said evenly. "Just the usual wolves out this way." Owen murmured, clearly unconvinced but too polite to press an old friend's daughter on matters that were, ultimately, none of his business. "Well, if you do happen across such a creature, best to steer clear. Whatever trouble it's wrapped up in sounds like the kind that follows a person home." The warning settled heavily in Alira's chest as she made her way back through the village, the sack of supplies balanced against her hip. She had already suspected the wolf sheltering in her home carried some manner of danger with him, but hearing it confirmed by someone outside her own small world made the reality far more concrete, far harder to dismiss as simple caution. Near the edge of the square, Mira's voice caught her attention before she could slip away unnoticed. "Alira," the other Omega called, falling into step beside her with an expression that mixed genuine concern with barely restrained judgment. "I heard you traded your mother's bracelet." "For what exactly?" "Supplies," Alira replied simply, unwilling to explain further. "For that wolf," Mira pressed, not really a question. "Alira, you heard Owen same as I did. Soldiers are actively searching for whatever creature you're keeping in your home. Coin is being offered for information. Do you understand what that means? If someone else discovers what you're hiding before you decide to send it away, you could be blamed for helping it escape justice, whatever justice actually applies here." "He hasn't done anything to warrant justice," Alira said, her voice steady despite the frustration building beneath her calm exterior. "He's wounded and healing, that's all I know for certain. Everything else is rumor and coin-driven speculation." "And if the rumors are true?" Mira pressed further. "If this wolf is dangerous, exactly as described?" "You're blind, Alira. You can't see what threat you might be sheltering, no matter how gentle it seems in quiet moments by your fire. The words stung more than Alira wanted to admit, striking at an insecurity she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. She could not see the wolf's true nature, could not verify with her own eyes whatever danger he might represent, beyond the trust she had built through instinct and shared silence. But something deeper than sight told her the creature, sheltering in her home, meant her no harm, had never once shown her anything but gentleness, despite whatever violence apparently followed him. "I trust what I feel," she said finally, meeting Mira's judgment with quiet conviction. "And what I feel is a creature in pain who has never once threatened me, not in word, not in action, not in anything beyond the fear I sense whenever danger draws near. Whatever he's running from, I don't believe it's something he deserved." Mira shook her head, clearly frustrated by Alira's stubbornness, but ultimately let the matter drop, offering only a final warning before departing. "Just be careful, please. I'd rather see you cautious than sorry." Alira continued her journey home, the weight of the conversation settling alongside the physical weight of the supplies she carried. By the time she reached her cabin, the sun had begun its slow descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the snow-covered path. Kaylin met her at the door with obvious relief, pressing close against her side the moment she stepped inside. "I'm fine," she reassured him, setting down the sack of supplies with a tired sigh. "Got us enough to last a while longer at least." She paused, considering whether to share what she had learned in the village, before deciding honesty, even one-sided, mattered more than protective silence. "People are talking about you. Soldiers offering coin for information. Warnings about danger following you home. I don't know exactly what you're running from, but I know it's serious." Kaylin listened, guilt washing through him at the burden his presence had placed upon her. The sacrifice of her mother's bracelet, the judgment of neighbors who questioned her choices, the very real danger that continued closing in around them both. He pressed his head gently against her hand, wishing desperately for words that remained just beyond his reach. "Whatever it is," Alira continued softly, kneeling beside him as she often did in these quiet evening moments, "I meant what I said to Mira. I trust what I feel, and what I feel is that you're worth protecting, regardless of whatever rumors follow you through these woods." That night, as they shared a meal slightly more substantial than the meager portions of recent days, Kaylin found himself watching her, with an intensity that had nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with the growing certainty settling deep in his chest. She had traded away her mother's memory, faced judgment from her community, and continued defending him, without ever once knowing the true weight of what she protected. The time for hiding, he understood now, with absolute clarity, had nearly run its course. Whatever came next, she deserved to face it with full knowledge of exactly who and what she had chosen to shelter within her home. The attack came without warning, 3 nights after Alira's trip to the village, when the moon hung low and heavy behind thick clouds that blotted out any light that might have warned them sooner. Kaylin smelled them before he heard anything, 3 distinct scents cutting through the cold night air, moving with the coordinated precision of trained hunters, rather than the scattered searching of earlier patrols. He rose instantly, every muscle coiled with alarm, positioning himself between the door and the mat where Alira slept peacefully, unaware of the danger closing in around her home. A branch snapped outside, deliberate rather than accidental, followed by low murmured voices confirming what Kaylin already suspected. These were not soldiers following official orders. These were Garrick's men, sent to finish what the original assassination attempt had failed to accomplish. The door shuddered under a sudden impact, wood splintering as it gave way entirely, and 3 wolves surged into the small cabin with brutal efficiency, eyes immediately locking onto Kaylin's form near the hearth. Alira woke with a startled gasp, scrambling upright, disoriented by the sudden chaos and the growls now filling her once peaceful home. Kaylin, the name left one intruder's mouth in confirmation of exactly who they had cornered, any pretense of secrecy abandoned now that their target had been found. Understanding flooded through Alira, even without full comprehension, recognizing the name, recognizing the sudden shift in danger from vague rumor to immediate reality. She scrambled backward, reaching instinctively for the walking stick propped near her bed, though against 3 armed intruders, the makeshift weapon offered little real protection. Kaylin understood, in that instant, that continued silence would cost more than any revelation ever could. With a surge of strength, drawn from desperation and healing wounds alike, he called upon the shift he had suppressed for nearly 2 weeks, his body contorting and reshaping itself from wolf to man in a single fluid motion that left him kneeling, bare and breathless, before the startled intruders. Kalen Voss, one of the wolves, confirmed, shifting as well into human form, revealing a scarred face twisted with grim satisfaction. Garrick will be pleased. Thought you'd bled out somewhere in these woods weeks ago. Tell Garrick, Kalen said, rising unsteadily to his feet despite the vulnerability of his healing body, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command even stripped of crown and armor. That betrayal always finds its reckoning eventually. The first intruder lunged toward Kalen without hesitation, clearly expecting an easy target given his known injuries, and for a moment, the impact drove Kalen back against the wooden table, breath knocked from his lungs. But years of discipline surfaced beneath the pain, muscle memory guiding his hands, even as his body screamed protest, redirecting the attacker's momentum and turning weakness into brief, decisive advantage. The fight that followed was brief, but fierce. Kalen's weakened state, offset by years of combat training that no amount of injury could fully erase. Alira, though blind to the exact movements unfolding around her, used every advantage her heightened senses provided, throwing whatever objects came within reach toward the sound of unfamiliar voices, disrupting their coordination at crucial moments. A thrown pot struck one assailant across the shoulder, sending him stumbling into Kalen's path at precisely the right moment for a decisive blow to end the confrontation. Within minutes, 2 of the 3 intruders lay unconscious on the cabin floor, while the third, recognizing the shifting odds, fled back into the darkness beyond the broken door, disappearing into the trees before Kalen could catch him. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by ragged breathing and the soft whimper of wind sneaking through the shattered doorway. "Elira," Kalen said, his voice steadying despite the exhaustion pulling at every limb. "Are you hurt?" She stood frozen near her bed, chest heaving, processing the voice now speaking directly to her for the first time, deep and commanding despite its exhaustion, entirely different from anything she had expected from the creature she had nursed back to health over the past 2 weeks. "You can talk," she said finally, disbelief coloring every word. You were never actually a wolf, were you? Not the way I thought." "I am a wolf," Kalen said carefully, moving closer, though he kept enough distance to respect whatever fear might be building behind her sightless eyes. "But I am also a man. Both are true. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." Elira's hands trembled as she processed the revelation, her mind racing back through every moment of the past 2 weeks, every conversation shared with a creature she believed could not understand her, every secret confided to someone who, it turned out, had comprehended every single word. "Who are you?" she asked slowly, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected an answer far larger than she was prepared for. "Kalen Voss," he said simply, the name carrying weight, even in the quiet destruction of her small cabin. "Alpha King of the Nightfall Kingdom. 3 weeks ago, men I trusted tried to end my life, and I fled here, wounded and desperate, never expecting to find the kindness you've shown me since." Silence stretched between them, heavy with implication, while outside, the wind continued its restless movement through the broken doorway, scattering snow across the floor, where 2 unconscious traitors still lay sprawled amid the wreckage of Alira's home. "The Alpha King," she repeated eventually, something between disbelief and dawning realization coloring her tone. "I fed the Alpha King my last meal. I argued with Mira about protecting the Alpha King. I traded my mother's bracelet for supplies to feed the Alpha King." A strange, slightly hysterical laugh escaped her, despite the tension still thick in the air. "You could have told me. At any point over these past 2 weeks, you could have told me." "Would you have believed me?" Kalen asked gently, moving another cautious step closer. A starving stray suddenly speaking, claiming to be a king hunted by his own court? "I feared you might have thought me either mad or dangerous, and either belief could have sent you running toward help that would only have exposed you to greater risk." Alira considered this, her earlier shock slowly settling into something more contemplative. "Maybe," she admitted. "Or maybe I would have understood faster than you gave me credit for. I've spent my whole life being underestimated because of what people assume blindness means about my judgment. Seems you did the same thing, in your own way." The observation struck Kalen with unexpected force. a truth he had not fully considered until she spoke it plainly. He had withheld his identity out of caution, yes, but also, if he were honest with himself, out of the same reflexive assumption that had governed so much of his life at court, that vulnerability, fully revealed, invited exploitation rather than trust. Illyra had proven, day after day, that such assumptions did not universally hold true. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have trusted you sooner. I'm sorry." Illyra nodded slowly, processing the apology alongside everything else demanding her attention in this sudden, overwhelming shift of circumstance. "What happens now?" she asked, gesturing vaguely toward the unconscious intruders still lying across her floor, toward the shattered door letting in the cold night air, toward a life that had irrevocably changed within the span of a single violent hour. Kaelin moved to check the two fallen assassins, confirming they remained unconscious rather than dead, before turning back toward Illyra, with an expression she could not see but felt clearly in the careful gentleness of his voice. "Now," he said, "I owe you the full truth. Everything. And then, whatever choice you make about what comes next, I will respect it completely, though I hope, more than anything, that you'll allow me to properly repay the kindness you've shown a stranger, who turned out to be far more complicated than any starving stray." Outside, the storm clouds finally began parting, revealing a sliver of moon that cast pale light across the wreckage of what had, until tonight, been a simple and peaceful home. Illyra drew a steadying breath, reaching out instinctively toward the sound of Kaelin's voice, her fingers finding his arm in the darkness, solid and real, in a way that felt entirely different from the fur she had grown accustomed to touching. "I think I've earned that much, don't you?" They sat together near the hearth, once the fire had been rebuilt against the night's chill. The two unconscious traitors bound securely with rope, Kaelin found, coiled beneath Illyra's workbench, their fate a matter he would address once dawn arrived, and clearer thinking prevailed. For now, he owed Illyra an explanation 2 weeks overdue, and he intended to deliver it without omission. "My council includes 12 members," he began, settling across from her with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders against the lingering cold. "Nobles from various territories within Nightfall Kingdom, each meant to advise on matters of governance, trade, and defense. Garrick has served among them for nearly 6 years, and until 3 weeks ago, I considered him one of the more reliable voices in that room." "What changed?" Illyra asked, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm water, the closest thing to tea her remaining supplies could offer. "Ambition, apparently," Kaelin said, bitterness threading through the admission. "I don't yet know the full extent of his plan, only that arrows found me in my own courtyard, loosed by hands I trusted, and that Garrick has spent the weeks since positioning himself as the reasonable voice, suggesting the kingdom prepare for leadership beyond my own, should I prove permanently absent." "He wants your throne," Illyra said plainly, cutting through diplomatic phrasing to the heart of the matter. "It appears so," Kaelin confirmed, though understanding his motivation matters less right now than understanding what comes next. "Those 2 men bound on your floor will be missed by their allies before long, and Garrick will know soon enough that his attempt failed a second time. Whatever caution I exercised these past 2 weeks, hiding here, healing quietly, that time has run its course." Illyra absorbed this information slowly, her mind still working to reconcile the gentle creature she had nursed with the powerful, hunted king, now sitting across from her fire. "Why did you come here of all places?" she asked eventually. "Thornwood territory is remote, but surely there were closer places to seek shelter." "Instinct," Kaelin admitted. "I smelled wood smoke on the wind and followed it without any real plan beyond survival. I expected, if anything, to be turned away, or worse, reported to whatever authority happened to be nearest. I never expected the door to open, and certainly never expected what waited for me once it did." Something in his tone made Illyra's cheeks warm, despite the tension still lingering from the night's violence. "I would do the same again," she said quietly. "Regardless of what I know now. A creature suffering deserves help, whether that creature turns out to be a stray dog or a hunted king." Kaelin studied her carefully in the dim firelight, taking in details he had only previously experienced through touch and sound, the quiet strength in her posture, the calluses on her hands earned through years of independent labor, the way her sightless eyes still somehow conveyed every emotion moving through her with startling clarity. "You gave me your last meal," he said softly. "Traded your mother's memory for supplies to keep feeding a creature you believed could not even understand your kindness. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people offering gestures, calculated for advantage, Elira. I have never, not once, encountered anything as genuinely selfless as what you've shown me these past 2 weeks. Elira shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his gratitude, unused to such direct acknowledgement. It wasn't selfless, she said eventually. Or maybe it was, I don't know. It just felt like the only decent thing to do. I couldn't have lived with myself, turning away a creature in that much pain. Regardless of the reasoning, Kaelin continued, it changed something in me. I came to your door as a hunted animal with nothing left to offer anyone, and I leave it, whenever that time comes, having learned something about genuine care that no amount of political education ever taught me at court. He paused, considering his next words carefully. I find myself reluctant to leave at all, if I'm honest. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with implication neither seemed quite ready to fully address. Elira's fingers tightened slightly around her cup, her expression carefully composed despite the flutter of something unfamiliar building in her chest. You're a king, she said eventually, as though stating the obvious fact might somehow diminish whatever connection had grown between them over these past weeks. I'm a blind Omega living alone at the edge of packlands nobody else wants. Whatever this is, whatever gratitude or fondness has grown between us, surely you understand how impossible any future beyond this cabin would be. I understand how impossible it might seem, Kaelin replied carefully. But I have spent my entire reign surrounded by people who valued status and calculation above genuine character, and I have never once felt as understood, as truly seen, as I have during these past 2 weeks in your care. Blindness has never diminished your strength, Elira. If anything, it has sharpened your perception of things that matter far more than sight ever could. She thought of every year spent proving her worth, to a pack that measured value through sight and strength alone. Every quiet moment of doubt she had swallowed rather than voiced. Every small victory earned through stubborn persistence, rather than acknowledgement freely given. To hear a king, of all people, speak of her perception as sharper rather than lesser, felt almost too large a gift to accept without suspicion. And yet nothing in his voice carried the hollow ring of flattery she might have expected from someone accustomed to using words as currency. Elira remained quiet for a long moment, processing words that felt both wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. What happens now? She asked again, though this time the question carried different weight than her earlier inquiry about the unconscious traitors on her floor. Assuming you survive whatever confrontation with Garrick lies ahead, assuming your kingdom accepts your return, what exactly would you propose happens to whatever this is between us? Kaelin considered his answer carefully, aware that whatever he said next would shape not just the immediate future, but potentially the rest of both their lives. I don't yet know every detail of what comes next, he admitted honestly, but I know I don't want to walk away from you and pretend these past 2 weeks meant nothing beyond simple survival. I know I want you beside me, whatever form that takes, whether court accepts it easily or fights against it every step of the way. Before Elira could respond, a soft groan interrupted the moment, one of the bound traitors stirring toward consciousness on the cabin floor. Kaelin rose immediately, expression hardening back into the commanding presence befitting his true position, the tenderness of moments before tucked carefully away beneath practical urgency. We'll need to move quickly once dawn breaks, he said, checking the ropes, securing both prisoners. These 2 will need to be transported somewhere secure, and I'll need to send word to Doran, my captain, confirming I'm alive and gathering my strength to return. Garrick will not wait patiently once he learns tonight's attempt has failed. Elira nodded, setting aside her cup and rising with renewed purpose despite the exhaustion and uncertainty still swirling within her. Then we should prepare, she said simply, falling into the practical rhythm that had guided her through every hardship her isolated life had thrown at her thus far. Whatever comes next, we'll face it properly. The word we settled between them again, familiar now from the quiet routines of recent weeks, but carrying entirely new weight given everything just revealed. Kaelin watched her move through the cabin with steady confidence, despite the chaos of the night, and felt, with growing certainty, that whatever battles lay ahead at Nightfall Castle, he wanted this woman standing beside him through every single one of them. Outside, the last remnants of storm cloud finally cleared entirely, revealing a sky scattered with stars that neither of them could fully appreciate in the moment, too consumed by the practical concerns of survival and the quiet, unspoken promises building steadily between them with each passing hour. Dawn arrived pale and quiet over Thornwood territory, though little of the previous night's calm remained within the walls of Alira's cabin. The two captured traitors sat bound and silent near the broken doorway, watched carefully by Kalen as he considered the logistics of transporting prisoners while still recovering his full strength. Alira moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, though her mind remained far from settled, turning over everything revealed in the darkness of the previous hours. "You've grown quiet," Kalen observed eventually, once the immediate practical concerns had been addressed and a temporary calm settled over the cabin. "Regretting your honesty from last night, or simply processing everything at once?" Alira set down the bowl she had been cleaning, considering how best to voice the tangle of thoughts crowding her mind since dawn broke. "Both, maybe," she admitted. "I keep thinking about what happens when we reach your kingdom. Your court, your advisors, everyone who serves you. What will they think, seeing their king return with a blind Omega from the borderlands trailing behind him?" "They will think whatever they think," Kalen replied, though he recognized the deeper fear woven through her question. "But their opinions carry no weight over what I choose to value, or who I choose to keep close." "That's easy to say," Alira countered, frustration edging into her voice for the first time since the revelation of his true identity. "But you've lived your entire life surrounded by status and expectation. I've lived mine at the margins, tolerated at best by my own pack because of what I lack. Your nobles will see a blind Omega with nothing to offer beyond charity, taken in during your weakest moment. They won't see whatever value you claim to find in me." Kalen moved closer, kneeling before her despite the ache still lingering in his healing side. "Then they will be wrong," he said firmly. "And I will correct that misunderstanding as many times as necessary, for as long as necessary, until the truth of your worth becomes as clear to them as it already is to me." Alira shook her head, though something in his conviction eased the sharpest edge of her worry. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "It's not just their judgment I fear, it's what comes with being associated with a king who has enemies willing to send assassins into a private home. If I return with you, if court and kingdom alike come to know my name connected to yours, I become a target too. Not just of judgment, but of genuine danger." This fear, Kalen recognized immediately, carried far more weight than concerns over court gossip or noble disdain. He considered his response carefully, unwilling to dismiss legitimate danger with empty reassurance. "You're right," he said honestly. "Association with me carries real risk, and I won't pretend otherwise. Garrick and whoever else conspires against me will see you as a threat the moment they understand your significance in my life. That danger is real, and I take it seriously." "Then perhaps," Alira said slowly, though the words seemed to cost her something significant to voice aloud, "perhaps it would be safer, for both of us, if I remained here. You return to your kingdom, reclaim your throne, deal with Garrick's betrayal properly, and I continue my life as it was before the storm brought you to my door." The suggestion struck Kalen with unexpected force, a sharp pang of loss at the very idea of walking away from her now, after everything shared between them these past weeks. "Is that what you want?" he asked carefully, searching her expression for the truth beneath her carefully composed offer. "To remain here, alone, while I return to my life without you?" Alira hesitated, her composure cracking slightly at the direct question. "No," she admitted finally, quietly. "That's not what I want. But wanting something and it being wise are not always the same thing." "No," Kalen agreed, reaching out to take her hand gently in his own. "They are not always the same, but I have spent my entire reign making decisions based on what seemed wise according to advisors and tradition and calculated political advantage, and very little of that wisdom ever brought me genuine peace or happiness. What I want, Alira, more than wisdom, more than caution, is you standing beside me through whatever comes next, danger included." "And if that danger reaches me," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "because of a choice made not from wisdom, but from want? Then I will spend every resource, every guard, every ounce of authority granted to me by my crown, ensuring that danger never touches you," Kalen said firmly. "I failed to protect you from Garrick's men reaching your very doorstep last night, and that failure will not repeat itself. I promise you that." Alira remained quiet for a long moment, processing the weight of his conviction alongside her own lingering fears. Finally she spoke, her voice steadier than before. "I've spent 3 years being told, in various ways, that my blindness makes me less capable, less valuable, less deserving of full participation in the world around me. I refuse to let fear of judgment or danger convince me to hide myself away again, not when I've finally found something, someone, worth standing beside despite whatever risk that choice carries. Kaelin's chest tightened with something close to relief, mixed with fierce protectiveness. Then you'll come with me, he said, more confirmation than question. I'll come with you, Illyra agreed, but you'll need to prepare your court properly. I won't be paraded in as some charity case or curiosity. If I stand beside you, I stand as an equal, whatever title that eventually requires. Agreed, Kaelin said without hesitation, admiration coloring his tone at her unwavering conditions. You will be treated with exactly the respect and equality you deserve, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer directly to me. Before returning to her packing, Illyra paused at the threshold of the cabin that had sheltered her for 3 years, running her fingers along the familiar doorframe one last time. This small home had been her entire world, built from necessity and quiet independence, and leaving it behind felt like closing a chapter she had never expected to end. Yet beneath the ache of that farewell sat something steadier, a growing certainty that whatever waited beyond this doorway mattered more than the safety of everything familiar left behind. Later that morning, once the prisoners had been secured more thoroughly and basic preparations made for the journey ahead, Kaelin sent a message through a passing hawk, one of the few resources still available to him, even in his weakened, hunted state, confirming his survival to Doran and requesting a discreet escort to bring them safely toward Nightfall Castle. The response would take time to arrive, giving them at least a day or two more within the relative safety of Illyra's cabin, before the true challenges of returning to court began in earnest. As they waited, Illyra found herself gathering what few possessions she owned worth bringing, though the process felt strange, uprooting a life built carefully over 3 years of solitary independence. Kaelin watched her movements with quiet appreciation, recognizing the courage required to leave behind everything familiar for a future full of uncertainty and potential danger. Thank you, he said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them, as afternoon light filtered through the cabin's remaining window. For choosing this, for choosing me, despite every reasonable argument against it. Illyra paused in her packing, turning toward the sound of his voice with a small, genuine smile. You shared your fear with me when you couldn't speak, she said softly. You protected me the moment you could. Seems only fair I choose to stand beside you now that the truth is finally out in the open between us. Outside, the first hawk carrying Kaelin's message disappeared into the distance, carrying word of survival and hope toward a castle still reeling from uncertainty, while inside the cabin, 2 people prepared themselves for a future neither could have imagined when a storm first brought a wounded stray to a blind woman's door. Doran arrived 2 days later, leading a small, discreet escort, chosen specifically for their loyalty, rather than their rank. Men who had served under Kaelin long enough to earn absolute trust. The captain's relief upon seeing his king alive was evident in the way his usual composed demeanor cracked slightly, a rare display of emotion from a man known throughout the castle for his steady, unshakable presence. We feared the worst, Doran admitted, clasping Kaelin's forearm firmly. Garrick has grown bold in your absence, pressing the council daily toward accepting your death as inevitable fact. Garrick's boldness ends today, Kaelin replied grimly, gesturing toward the 2 bound prisoners still secured within the cabin. These men can confirm his involvement directly. Between their testimony and my own survival, his ambitions collapse the moment we return. Doran's gaze shifted curiously toward Illyra, standing quietly beside Kaelin with a composure that betrayed little of the uncertainty still churning beneath her calm exterior. Kaelin noticed the silent question and addressed it directly. This is Illyra, he said, an unmistakable note of protectiveness coloring his introduction. She sheltered me these past weeks, nursed me back to health, and will be returning with us to Nightfall Castle. She is to be treated with the same respect afforded any guest of the crown. Understood? Understood, my king, Doran replied without hesitation, though curiosity remained evident in his expression as he offered Illyra a respectful nod she could not see, but sensed through the shift in his tone. Whatever she did to keep you alive and hidden this long, the kingdom owes her a debt. The journey toward Nightfall Castle took the better part of 2 days, careful and deliberate to avoid drawing attention from Garrick's remaining allies who might still be watching the roads. Illyra rode alongside Kaelin, her nervousness about the unfamiliar journey, tempered by his steady presence beside her. his voice describing landmarks and terrain that her own senses could not fully perceive, ensuring she felt included rather than simply transported. Along the way, Doran rode close enough to speak quietly with Elira, curiosity finally overtaking his usual reserve. "The king rarely trusts easily," he said, careful to keep his tone respectful rather than probing. "Whatever you did to earn that trust in only 2 weeks, it must have been remarkable." "I only did what seemed decent," Elira replied simply. "Fed a hungry creature, tended a wound. Nothing more remarkable than that." Doran considered her answer for a long moment before responding. "Perhaps that's exactly why it worked," he said. "Most people who meet the king already know who he is before they ever speak a word to him. You offered kindness with nothing to gain from it. That's rarer than you might realize, especially within these castle walls." When they finally arrived within sight of the castle itself, Elira could sense the shift in atmosphere immediately. The murmur of a large gathered crowd, the weight of countless eyes turning toward their approaching party. Word of the king's survival had apparently spread ahead of their arrival, drawing nobles and commoners alike to witness the return of a ruler many had believed lost entirely. Kaelin dismounted first, offering Elira careful assistance despite her capable independence, an unspoken acknowledgement that this moment required them to stand together from its very first public appearance. The crowd's murmur grew louder as they processed not just their king's return, but the unfamiliar woman standing confidently beside him, her sightless eyes turned toward the sound of the gathered assembly, with quiet dignity, despite the obvious scrutiny. Garrick emerged from among the assembled council members, his composed mask slipping visibly at the sight of Kaelin very much alive and standing before the entire court. "My king," he said, recovering quickly enough to offer a bow that fooled no one paying close attention. "We feared the worst. What miraculous circumstance brings you back to us?" "Miraculous indeed," Kaelin replied, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, edged with barely restrained fury beneath its composed surface. "I survived an assassination attempt orchestrated within these very walls, Garrick, and I have brought with me proof of exactly whose ambition drove that betrayal." The crowd's murmur shifted immediately into shocked whispers, all eyes turning toward Garrick as guards, at Doran's signal, moved to escort the 2 bound prisoners forward, men whose testimony would soon confirm every suspicion Kaelin had carried since that first cold night in Elira's cabin. Garrick's composure finally shattered entirely, ambition and desperation warring visibly across his features, as he realized the full scope of his failure laid bare before the entire court. "Lies," he attempted, though the word carried little conviction against the mounting evidence surrounding him. "Whatever these men claim, it's fabrication meant to discredit." "Enough," Kaelin cut through the protest, with the authority of a king finally reclaiming his rightful place. "Your ambition has cost this kingdom weeks of uncertainty, and nearly cost me my life. You will answer for that betrayal, according to the full weight of our laws." As guards moved to detain Garrick amid the shocked murmurs of the assembled court, attention gradually shifted toward the woman still standing quietly beside their newly returned king, her presence raising questions that whispered rapidly through the crowd. Kaelin, sensing the shift, drew Elira gently closer, his voice carrying clearly enough for the entire court to hear. "This is Elira," he announced, pride evident in every word. "When I fled here wounded and hunted, believing myself moments from death, she took me in without hesitation, sharing what little she possessed to nurse me back to health, never once knowing who or what she sheltered. Her kindness saved my life, and in doing so, saved this kingdom from the chaos Garrick's betrayal would have otherwise unleashed." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some clearly skeptical of an Omega from remote borderlands, standing so prominently beside their king, while others seemed genuinely moved by the story unfolding before them. Elira felt the weight of countless eyes and judgments pressing against her, but drew strength from Kaelin's steady presence beside her, refusing to shrink beneath scrutiny she had faced, in smaller forms, her entire life. "I make no secret of my intentions," Kaelin continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. "Elira will remain here, honored as she deserves, and any who question her worth will find themselves questioning my judgment directly. I trust that carries sufficient weight to settle whatever doubts linger among you." The declaration, bold and unmistakable, settled over the crowd with the weight of absolute authority, leaving little room for continued open skepticism, whatever private doubts might persist beneath polite silence. Elira, standing tall despite the storm of attention surrounding her, felt something settle within her chest that she had rarely experienced throughout her isolated life. The sense of belonging somewhere, truly and completely, not despite her limitations, but entirely apart from them. As guards escorted Garrick away to face formal judgment, and the crowd slowly began dispersing amid continued murmurs and speculation, Kalen turned toward Elira with quiet relief evident in his expression. "The hardest part is finished," he said softly, for her ears alone. "Now begins the work of proving, day after day, that today's declaration was not merely words, but genuine commitment." "I'm ready for that work," Elira replied, her voice steady, despite everything she had just endured. "I've spent my whole life proving myself against low expectations. This won't be so different." Kalen's hand found hers, steady and warm despite the chaos still settling around them. A silent promise carried forward from that first storm-torn night, when a wounded stray found unexpected shelter in a blind woman's unwavering kindness. Weeks passed following Garrick's formal judgment and removal from the council. Weeks during which Elira slowly adjusted to life within the walls of a castle far grander and busier than anything her quiet borderland existence had prepared her for. The transition was not without its difficulties. Some nobles remained coldly polite at best, their true opinions of an Omega from remote territory kept carefully hidden behind practiced courtesy, while a smaller number showed genuine warmth, drawn by curiosity or admiration for the story that had already spread throughout the kingdom. Among those who embraced her most readily was Faye, a lady of the court, known for her sharp wit and equally sharp perception of character beneath surface appearances. She sought out Elira within the first week, offering conversation that felt refreshingly free of calculation or judgment. "You've caused quite a stir," Faye said one afternoon, settling beside Elira in the castle gardens where the other woman had taken to spending quiet hours, the familiar sounds of nature offering comfort amid the overwhelming newness surrounding her. "Half the court can't decide whether to admire your courage or resent your sudden prominence." "And you?" Elira asked, having learned quickly to gauge sincerity through tone alone, a skill her blindness had sharpened over years of necessity. "I admire anyone brave enough to challenge expectations that were never fair to begin with," Faye replied honestly. "You saved our king's life without knowing who he was, defended him against your own community's judgment, and now stand here facing an entire court's scrutiny without flinching. That takes considerably more strength than most people in these halls possess, whatever their sight allows them to see." Within her first month at court, Elira had already begun quietly petitioning for changes to how the kingdom treated Omegas and those living with disabilities along its more remote territories, drawing on her own experience to advocate for resources and respect too long withheld from those the pack structure often overlooked. Kalen supported every proposal without hesitation, recognizing in her requests the same practical wisdom that had once kept her alive and thriving alone at the edge of Thornwood territory. Such moments of genuine connection helped ease the isolation Elira occasionally felt within the castle's grand but sometimes cold formality, reminders that acceptance, while not universal, existed in meaningful pockets throughout her new life. Kalen, for his part, remained steadfast in his public and private commitment, ensuring every formal function included her presence. Every decision, affecting the kingdom's direction, incorporated her perspective, refusing to allow anyone's doubt to diminish the value he placed upon her judgment and character. 3 months after her arrival, Kalen called for a formal gathering of the full court, the announcement carrying an air of significance that set the entire castle buzzing with anticipation. Elira, sensing the importance of the occasion through Kalen's careful preparation and quiet nervousness in the days leading up to it, found herself equally anxious about whatever announcement he intended to make. "You seem tense," she observed the morning of the gathering, her hand resting against his arm as they prepared to enter the great hall together. "More tense than I've seen you since we arrived here." "Today matters more than most," Kalen admitted, though he offered no further explanation, a rare secrecy that only heightened her curiosity rather than easing it. The great hall, when they entered, was filled beyond its usual capacity. Nobles and advisors, and even a scattering of common folk gathered to witness whatever announcement had drawn such widespread attention. Kalen led Elira toward the raised platform, where his throne stood, though instead of taking his seat immediately, he turned to face the assembled crowd, with Elira standing beside him. 3 months ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I stood before many of you having just survived betrayal that nearly cost me everything. I told you then that a woman from Thornwood territory had saved my life through kindness, offered without any knowledge of who I truly was. Today I stand before you again, not simply to reaffirm that gratitude, but to formally declare my intentions moving forward." He turned toward Elira, taking her hand gently in his own before continuing, his voice softening slightly despite still carrying across the vast hall. "Elira has shown me, through action rather than empty words, exactly what genuine character looks like. She gave freely, when she had almost nothing to give. She defended my worth before she knew my name. She chose to stand beside me, despite every reasonable argument suggesting she walk away instead. I can think of no one more deserving of standing as my equal, my mate, and this kingdom's future queen." Gasps rippled through the assembled crowd, though genuine surprise mixed with expressions ranging from delight to lingering skepticism among the nobility. Elira, despite months of preparation and quiet conversations anticipating some version of this moment, still felt the full weight of the declaration settle over her with startling clarity, her heart racing as Kaelin knelt before her, formally, in full view of the entire court. "Elira of Thornwood," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath its surface, "will you accept this crown, not because status or tradition demands it, but because I want, more than anything, to build the remainder of my reign and my life alongside someone whose kindness taught me more about true leadership than any advisor ever managed?" Elira, moved beyond words for a long moment, finally found her voice, steady and clear despite the tears gathering unbidden at the corners of her sightless eyes. "I accept," she said simply, "not for the crown, but for you, and for this life we've chosen to build together, despite everything that once seemed impossible." The hall erupted into applause, genuine celebration overtaking whatever lingering doubts had persisted among certain corners of the court, the story of a blind Omega's selfless kindness, transforming, in that singular moment, into the foundation of a partnership the kingdom would come to celebrate for years afterward. Faye, watching from among the crowd, smiled with genuine warmth, already anticipating the influence Elira's quiet strength would bring to court customs long overdue for change. In the months that followed, Elira settled fully into her new role, bringing perspective and compassion to policies that had long overlooked those living at the margins of society, much as she once had. Her presence within the court gradually shifted attitudes that had once dismissed blindness or Omega status as limitations, proving instead, through consistent action and quiet wisdom, that true strength took many forms beyond what sight or traditional status could measure. Kaelin, in turn, found himself a steadier, more grounded ruler than he had ever been before, the lessons learned during those quiet weeks in Elira's cabin, remaining with him through every subsequent decision, every policy, every interaction with those who served beneath him. He never forgot the storm that had brought him, wounded and desperate, to a stranger's door, nor the simple bowl of shared stew that had first revealed a kindness capable of reshaping an entire kingdom's future. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first found each other, Elira would smile and tell the story simply, without embellishment, exactly as it had happened: a storm, a stray, a shared meal offered without hesitation or expectation, and from that quiet, selfless act, a love strong enough to weather betrayal, danger, and every doubt the world had tried to place between them, emerging instead as proof that true worth had never depended on sight, status, or crown, but simply on the unshakable kindness of a heart willing to give everything it had, even when it seemed to have nothing left to spare.